started off by removing the table saw and marking out where the first T-track is going to go. Then I set the depth on the skill saw and measured over for where my straight edge is going to be. And once the straight edge was clamped into place, I could make the cut. Now I went just shy of the thickness of the plywood, so I'm finishing off the cut with my razor knife. Then I just cleaned up the edges so that the T-track will sit flush. I put the first T-track in temporarily and marked out where the second T-track is going to go. So most of the aftermarket router table inserts are under 12 inches, so I'm going to go 12 inches from T-track to T-track in case I want to install a router table insert in the future. Then once I had it marked out, I clamped the straight edge to that piece of plywood and cut it off. Now I have the middle section of plywood. So I just dry fit everything up and make sure that the ruler slides freely. I mark the center line on the bottom piece of plywood left to right, and then position my router plate where I want my router to be, and then traced it. Using my 3/4 inch Forstner bit, I started a hole for my jigsaw. Once I had that circle cut out, I could put the top piece in place, put my router up against the bottom of it, and mark where the holes will be. Then I took the plate off and just made sure they lined up. Then I brought the top piece over to the drill press to drill out the holes. It's important that these holes are straight. And once the bolt holes were drilled, I could use a 1-inch paddle bit for the countersinks for the bolt heads. Then I dry fit everything up again, including the end piece that I cut to size off camera. I made the T-tracks a little proud of the surface so that I could plane them down to be exactly the same height as the tabletop. And once I was happy with the thickness, I could pre-drill and screw everything into place. And like everything else on this bench, I'm not using any glue in case I want to do a future upgrade. Once all the pieces were screwed down, I could install the router. I put a small straight bit in the router before I installed it so that I could plunge cut the hole and it would be perfectly centered. And once the pilot hole was cut for the router bit, I could remove the router and then open the hole up a little bit. That's it for the router table. Now I'm going to install the fence. I used the hole on the router table as my center line so that no matter which way I flip the fence, it'll be flush with the end of the table. I'm using a piece of MDF shelving for the main portion of the fence, and I'm going to use some 3/4 inch plywood for the supports. Once I had the MDF cut to the length I wanted, I ripped 2 pieces at 6 inches. And after the MDF was cut to its final size, I marked the center line on those pieces. Then I cut some blocks out of the 3/4 inch plywood. I cut 3 6-inch squares out of the 3/4 inch plywood, and then I cut 2 of them at 45, so I had 4 triangles and 2 squares. Then I held them in place and I marked the overhang. Now it's very important that these triangles be exactly 90 degrees, so I'm just double checking. Then I cut off the overhangs on the crosscut sled and screwed them in place. The other 2 I cut a little differently for the dust collection box. And then a quick time out to play with the 2-year-old. After that I softened all the edges that weren't going to be connected to anything on the router table. I lined up what was going to be the base of the fence and clamped it down. That way I could mark where the T-track slots would go. Then I drilled out the holes and put the bolts in. It gave it a test run. I cut 2 pieces out of the 3rd square, and then I traced out my shop vac hose. Once the hole was cut out, I brought it over to my drill press and gave it a quick sanding. Then I just made sure it fit snug and didn't fall out. I used a hole saw to drill through the MDF and then brought it over to the scroll saw to cut out the little mouse hole. I'm going to make my own knobs for this project, so I cut out 2 1.5 inch squares and drilled out the center. Once the hole was drilled out, I could install the nut and bolt and then pull it tight so that I could get an exact fit of where the nut was going to be and trace it out. Then just chisel out the hole for the nut. I removed the handle from my miter gauge fence and traced that out for the shape of the knob. Then I used a coping saw to cut it out. I gave it a quick sanding with some 80 grit to soften up the edges. Then I mixed up some epoxy and glued the nuts into place. And with all the pieces cut, it was time to assemble the fence. Then I installed everything and tightened it down to make sure it didn't wiggle. And that's it. Now, one of my favorite things about this is with the fence reversed and backed all the way up to the edge of the table, I can get more than a 24-inch rip capacity on my table saw. This is going to allow me to rip a sheet of plywood at any width I want, because if I need a piece greater than 24, say 28 inches, I can just put the fence at 20 inches and the cutoff will be 28. So I just added a couple scrap 2x4s to the back side of the router fence to hold my most commonly used router bits, and finished it off with a coat of Minwax. And that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to make some more T-tracks and make the rest of the bench an assembly area with a vise. As always, if you liked this video or found it helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time.